Director of Sales at TargetSmart.
My name is Kate Pazoles. I'm a director at Hattaway Communications, which is a strategic communications firm that works with visionary leaders helping people and the planet.
I'm David Shor. I am in charge of political R&D at Civis Analytics, which came out of the Obama campaign and is generally a data science consulting firm.
Hi, and I'm Drew Linzer. I'm the director and the chief scientist at Civiqs. We are a similarly named but completely separate entity based in Oakland, where we do online polling.
Great. Yeah, so I mean, we had a kind of a discussion last week about what this panel was going to look like, and I think one thing we wanted to really focus on is getting to some sense of agreement on what psychographics did in 2016 and what it didn't do, what Cambridge Analytica is and what it isn't. I think there's like a wealth of knowledge in this room that can contribute to that conversation, so it's exciting to have everybody here, and we're going to try to just keep this as kind of organic and fluid as possible and have as much engagement from you all as is up here. So, David, we had just talked. Do you want to start off? Like what, I think we hear this buzzword, psychographics, and we hear Cambridge Analytica, and it's like, the Republicans, they've quote unquote caught up to the the Obama 2012 machine and what happened and all this. And any first thoughts?
Yeah, I'll start by saying that a lot of people are saying that I think it's true that Republicans have caught up in digital and probably are honestly much more effective at doing digital buying than Democrats are. But I also think that Cambridge Analytica had basically nothing to do with that. Some of the reports out there, just in terms of hearsay, it seems like the Trump campaign spent considerably less per impression than the Hillary campaign. But most of that was handled by their traditional internal ad buying team and not by Cambridge Analytica, and used targeting that really didn't have that much to do with fancy psychographics. And so I think, as a movement, we should try to learn from what the Republicans are doing and adapt to it and surpass them. But it's kind of worrying that we've all focused on one firm that has really good internal marketing that, as far as I can tell, was basically pushed out of the Trump campaign by the end.
And may have ties to Russia.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah. All right. So I mean, I think then what I mean. So what when we think about psychographics, I mean, are there examples, Kate, that you are using in targeting when you do outreach? I mean, there's obviously data that we use on our side, from the Catalyst file to TargetSmart to DNC data to what's going on at some of the analytics firms. I mean, what really sticks out as a psychographic element, or what can kind of be used to kind of fill the like what's a real world example to fill our gap in knowledge of this stuff?
Yeah, so I can speak a little bit to what we've been doing on this. So we work with our clients to help them. We're a communications firm, so we work with our clients to help them frame their issues using narrative and storytelling in ways that will motivate and mobilize their target audiences. And for most of the time, we work with a lot of folks in the C3 space, so a lot of issue advocacy, a lot of nonprofits. And when we talk about targeting there, we're talking about demographic groups, because that's how these organizations know how to find and reach out to folks. But that leads to some missed opportunities, and especially, painting entire groups with very broad brushes. So talking about targeting millennials, they are not a homogenous group. They are, I think now, the largest voting eligible generation. They're obviously not all the same. So what we've been doing is working for the past couple years with some of our C3 clients to bring insights from psychology and social science, using theories like Maslow, like moral foundations theory, like Ocean and other personality theories, to look into really what are the differences in people's aspirations and motivations that we can tap into in order to target messaging more specifically to those motivations and get that higher level of engagement and personalization in the communications that we're doing. So rather than using these sort of sophisticated psychographic algorithms that Cambridge Analytica claims to be able to use, what we've been doing is research with the American adult population, which we did our original survey in 2015, and just recently we worked with Drew and his team at Civiqs to update that. And we did find 7 distinct segments of the population based on motivations. So these are our clever names for the segments. And what's interesting about them is some of them do look pretty similar demographically, but they have different aspirations and motivations that we can tap into in order to mobilize them to take action on these issues that they care about. And we can use these insights to tailor messages, but also images, the way we use stories, and the way that we reach out and the things that we ask them to do when it comes to engagement. So I'll just really quickly go through an example of this using 2 of the segments, the benevolent optimists and the secular moralists. And these are 2 groups that look very similar demographically. They're both about 60% Democrat. They are both young, almost 50% are under the age of 35. But they have different aspirations and motivations in life. So the benevolent optimists, one of their top goals in life is to make a difference in the world. And one of the values that they care most about is being a compassionate person, being open-minded to new ideas. In contrast, the secular moralists, one of their top aspirations for their lives is living by a strong moral code, but they are not religious. They are very not religious, but they do care about being fair-minded. So keeping in mind those differences in motivations, whoops, this is very sensitive. Here's an example of how we would tailor messages to each of those motivations. So you can see here for the benevolent optimists, these are messages about the issue of living wage, which is something that a lot of our clients are working on. So for the benevolent optimists, we tap into this compassion, motivation, and wanting to make a difference in the world through bringing in this idea of how it affects real people's lives. So living wages help people provide for their families, as opposed to the secular moralists, where we're talking about this idea of right versus wrong, this moral principle of if you're working full time, you should be making enough to make ends meet. And then you can see how this translates to images. So the benevolent optimists, we're showing an image of the goal that we're working towards, which is happy families who can support themselves. And for the secular moralists, we're showing an issue of the problem, which is this idea that these people are struggling to make ends meet, which is wrong. And similarly for storytelling, you see for benevolent optimists, we're tapping into this story of a CEO from a company in Maryland who's talking about how when his employees do well, his company does well, and who he cares about them and their success in addition to just the business financial bottom line, compared to this story from CNN about this single mother who makes minimum wage, which calculates out to $6,000 a year, which is obviously not right for someone working full time. And then call to action, you can also tailor differently. So for the benevolent optimists, we're asking them to get involved, make a difference, come together. And then for secular moralists, it's stand up for what you think is right. Stand up for these moral values that you have. So this is kind of what we mean when we talk about psychographics or psychological profiling. We're not like tapping into your neuroticism and your fears and trying to sort of manipulate you. What the angle that we take is that we're trying to identify what people are actually motivated by beyond their demographics, beyond their political affiliations, and tap into those motivations. And this can be used to message on any issue and really start to speak across the aisle, because most of these groups have a mix of Democrats and Republicans. So figuring out how to tap into those motivations can also help us broaden beyond our usual partisan groups.
So Drew, I mean, you was mentioning you guys did some of the survey work there. I mean, can you talk about what goes into that that's different than a regular survey, and then David, anything that Civis is doing similar that gets to these data points, and I'd like to actually kind of come back to where what this really is versus what's kind of being portrayed in the media with Cambridge Analytica, because it's something I hear about all the time, not just in the news but at my job, just kind of separating real world and what we're doing from kind of the big scary news that's that's out there.
Sure. Well, so as Kate said, we worked together to get the data that went into what she was presenting, and behind all of this really cool, nice-looking, smart end product, there's just a lot of nuts and bolts research that has to happen, and especially for some of these segmentation-type analyses where we're dividing up the population into what we believe, in this case, for 7 or more coherent groups, people with different sets of opinions on lots of different issues. You just need an enormous amount of data in order to meaningfully distinguish these groups in any way where you'd feel confident doing the sorts of split messaging that you're seeing here. So what does enormous amounts of data mean? Many more than 500 or even 1,000 surveys, which is kind of standard, maybe decreasingly so. I'm talking more like maybe 3, 4, 5,000 interviews. You need to ask lots of questions, maybe 25, 30 separate questions, so that you can actually get differences of opinion systematically across lots of different values here. And practically, it gets very expensive if you want to do this in any representative way. It gets very time consuming, and it's just hard generally. So what we do at Civiqs is we've taken survey research, we've automated it online. We save a lot of costs that way. Our approach is to use a panel, which we've built internally, and so we work together with Kate and her firm to put together a questionnaire that we could email to a representative sample of the folks in our panel. And then over a period of days, we're able to send out emails, have those folks who've already agreed to take surveys with us come back to our site and get the data into our system. And then we could do the analysis from there. So it's a new model of doing it, and I think it's necessitated by the demands of the folks at the end of the process to do the more interesting and nuanced types of analyses and distinctions that that they want to do.
Yeah, and I'll just add to that working with Drew's team is also giving us the ability to add a lot of nuance to these segments, because you all track and ask a number of questions on an almost daily basis of the panel members. So we have a lot of data that we're currently collecting, a lot of historical data about what these people think about certain issues, how they feel about candidates, and not just how they think they felt before the election, but how they actually answer that question then. So we'll be able, and we're in the process of adding more layers to what we know about the people who have taken our survey.
Yeah, thanks for that extra plug. But yeah, that's right. So since we have these people in a panel, they've interacted with us multiple times over, in some cases, many years. And so we can augment their response to this survey with things they've told us about themselves in the past, and it's a much richer data set as a result.
Yeah, David, anything that Civis is doing similar or differently? I mean, that you have, I know you all run the omnibus survey that gets kind of.
Oh yeah, we survey probably over, it depends on the week, but probably over 10 to 20,000 people a week. We're constantly doing message test experiments. We've kind of worked out agreements with dozens of different panels so that we can turn around these sort of message tests, generally sometimes in hours, but at least in a day or two. I'd say that the biggest value for all of this, I think it's really important to use just general psychographic research in social science when crafting your message. And I actually think that's not something that comes up in the survey research stage. It's something that really should be coming up earlier when people are creating content. Generally, my experience has been, you might work with with a pro-choice group or with an environmental group, and even though they want to test their messages and even though they want to build fancy heterogeneous treatment targeting models, when it comes to actually coming up with the 5 things that you're going to test, they just kind of sit around a room and come up with the same 5 things that everyone's always heard for the last 50 years. So I think the real power for using this kind of research, for structuring what things we test and what things we don't, is that as liberals, all of us in this room have this disadvantage that we're all really, really weird. And we just have fundamentally different motivations and values than most of the population, and not than swing voters. And so the most important thing for this is it's a framework that forces you to get out of your comfort zone and figure out how can I talk about this issue in a way that I normally wouldn't. Because generally, we've been talking about choice or environmentalism or about labor or about economic fairness the same way for like the last 70 years, and everyone who would have been persuaded by those messages already has been. So that's the real value. But I think, you know, it's almost not a technical thing. It's a matter of before you even talk to your polling firm, your creative firm should have social science researchers and should be thinking creatively about different ways to talk about issues.
Yeah.
So yeah, I mean, so then if you think about "Make America Great Again" and kind of the messaging that comes from that one slogan, I mean, it almost kind of proves your point in that conservative message is just so simple and like a fall in line.
Oh yeah, I think
Yeah.
a big advantage, just like a rough heuristic, is about 20% of the country identifies as liberal, about 40% as conservative, and 40% as moderates. And so I think that one natural advantage that Republicans have is that conservatives are less weird than liberals. Like the things that appeal to conservatives fundamentally are like, they have like more in common in terms of intrinsic motivations with moderates than liberals do. And so it's not that they're doing fancy psychographic research, but when they sit around and bullshit messages, those messages actually kind of appeal to people. And when we do that, those messages kind of turn people off. So that's like a natural disadvantage we have. And it's why it's really important for us to actually embrace social science research here.
And I think there's a difference between the messages that we're using to get to people and what their core attitudes are on some really basic questions. So if you say to someone just really simply, do you support stricter measures of gun control?
Right.
Yes or no? Right? That's pretty easy to measure. We can track that over a long period of time. How do you get to someone who tells you no on that question
Right.
and get them to act differently or think differently?
Right.
That's hard.
Yeah, and I think also, especially looking at, we have all of this research on targeting, on GOTV, on behaviors that we've done that's all just siloed, and bringing that all together into a body of knowledge that we can use to look at, that person that says they care about climate change and global warming in a survey, but then, has not donated to any organizations or, voted for any candidates that support those things. What is the disconnect there, and how can we speak to them in order to actually get them to take action based on the beliefs that they say that they have? Which is also a problem with surveys, is that people lie.
Everybody lies.
So, but yeah, I think that's a great point, that we need to bring the science into it sooner than just how we structure our experiments, which is, what we're trying to build here on the C3 side, and would be great to do on the political side as well, is sort of a body of knowledge that you can draw on to craft those messages in a way that are going to speak to people through their motivations and not just through what we think their motivations are, which is often, as you said, is often wrong.
Yeah, so I mean, it's a little bit then. It seems to me like it's like what the right did, and whether it was the Trump campaign or a consulting firm or the Russians, is they had like the tail wag the dog a little bit, and that they had the message, and the effectiveness of that just kind of let people reflect what they wanted to on it. I mean, it reminds me of like, how simple that yes we can, hope and change. Kind of people were able to reflect what they wanted into that message, and it almost happened in the same thing this year. And then, David, you were talking about how is this how like the trolls on Facebook were able to multiply in that kind of ease of like the easy message, or is that?
Yeah, I mean, I think that one advantage Trump had is just that kind of early on, and this is a bad thing for us to say because we're all consultants, but I think like early on the Trump campaign was so fringe that like no traditional Republican consultants would work with them, and I think he actually benefited a lot from this because as a result he came up with messages that just kind of sitting in a bathroom on Twitter that like that Republican politicians hadn't been making, and so I think that's just one aspect of persuasion which people neglect, which is that persuasion is really context specific, really and really time specific. One example that I really like is, we did experiments a long time ago in terms of which messages were the most persuasive to people. And generally, the messages that people tell you are the most persuasive often aren't the ones that are the most persuasive. And some of that is because people are just really bad at reverse engineering why they're persuaded by things. But some of it is just that if you go and you tell someone a message that they've already heard, it can't persuade them. So just one example is that I think the most popular thing that Barack Obama did was that, he killed Osama bin Laden, not personally, but if you go and tell people that, it doesn't persuade anyone because everybody already knows it's baked in. And so that's a big challenge, I think, for a lot of the content that we do, is that we recycle all of the same messages that people have been hearing in competitive political elections for their entire lives. And something that Trump benefited a lot from was that he wasn't paying anyone to tell them those messages, and he had to come up with new stuff.
So that hits an interesting point. And this could be all for all three of you, Drew. I'm looking at you, and then maybe see even some folks here in the crowd. Hagner, I know. When you're doing a survey, and without obviously revealing too much about your clients, how many times are you just really using the same survey over and over again? And that's the same questionnaire and the same themes, and is that something that's like a real problem that
Well, is it a problem?
Not for us, right? We get paid per survey, so.
This is something that actually bothered me early in my career as a pollster because I observed that was happening. And so what we're trying to do now is just take all of the questions that I see people coming to us with that everyone wants to know about, and what we've done is centralize that. So we ask that every day. We don't wait for someone to ask us to ask that. We just ask it and we track it. So I think that what we've got to do is just get more data flowing through all of our progressive infrastructure, and take away the need for people to ask the stuff that everyone wants to ask about, that baseline measurement stuff, so you can focus on the more interesting, more unique, race-specific or state-specific stuff. So it's something that happens. I know why it happens. What we're trying to do is maybe address that in one useful way, but people want the same stuff.
Yeah, I think just greater creativity, and that comes to firms like you guys, just in terms of coming up with messages that haven't been tested before. But I also think it's really hard to predict what works and what doesn't, and that's why testing is really important. I think last cycle, about a third of the ads we tested had backlash, which means that people were throwing, in some cases, tens of millions of dollars behind ad campaigns that had a negative impact. And that's actually happened to a lot of our clients. And so it's good when we find out and we can stop that. And so I think on one hand, there's two things that we could do to kind of cut that down. The first is moving from a framework of people sitting around a water cooler and testing the ways that they find an issue to be persuasive, and using social science like moral foundations theory or ocean and all of the psychographic stuff that they've talked about. But the second thing is just testing testing everything you can. And so we've built, just like them, we've built a lot of infrastructure in order to quickly test messages. And I think it's just really important. If you're going to be putting $1 million or $2 million behind an ad campaign, you should spend $10,000 to find out if it works. Because, it's...
Or more.
Yeah.
Yes. No, at the very least, we could start with that. Because I think right now, the vast majority of content that gets put out there isn't meaningfully tested. People will put things through a focus group, or they'll send a video to someone and say, oh, do you like this? But in terms of scientific A/B testing, very little content gets tested in that way. And most of it is that historically it's been very expensive. But there have been a lot of technological advances in the last year or two that have brought down the costs of these things a lot. So you should be reaching out to analytics firms for that.
Yeah, and I'll add to that. I think what you mentioned earlier in terms of, we need to spend more money and do more research in coming up with the messages and what are we testing? Because I think a lot of times folks do the approach of sitting around the table and coming up with stuff. Our approach is that we start with audience research from the very beginning, so that we can distill messages about oftentimes very complex and complicated issues into simple, everyday word-of-mouth language that people will actually retain and repeat. And we spend a lot of time talking to the actual audiences in order to do that. I think the other thing that's really important, that a pattern that we've seen in messaging especially, is that Republicans are very good at the sort of aspirational level messaging, while Democrats really want to get to, here's my solution and here's my fix for this thing and here's all the ways that we would do it and here's sort of the functional, how it works, how it benefits you, and talking at that level. And Republicans are much better at speaking to these emotional and aspirational levels. So we bring some approaches from social science that help our clients think about communicating on multiple levels and not just that functional, here's my policy solution and what I think we should do, but also the aspirational level, speaking to people's motivations and engaging them in those deeper ways to actually motivate them and get them to listen to things that, we've been talking about these issues for a long time, so we obviously need to come up with a new approach to how we do that.
Yeah, and personally, and I'm sure that you two have seen the same issue, we've gotten a lot of pushback sometimes from clients in terms of people can be really attached to speaking about an issue in one particular way. And that's, that's pretty bad. There's really no point in spending millions of dollars on an ad campaign if you don't want it to work. There's just something that I think, people who are running these campaigns need to internalize, which is that the way that you talk about an issue and the reason that you believe in an issue generally won't be the same thing, and to be comfortable about that and to just really confront yourself about, we're all prone to this cognitive bias of thinking that the reason, that the right way to talk about an issue is the stuff that really appeals to us. And, we're, as I said before, we're all really weird. And so just keeping in mind that in some ways, if an ad, if a creative agency shows you an ad and you like it, that's probably a bad sign. No, really. And so just keeping that in mind and not relying on your own internal gut, instead relying on social science and rigorous testing. That honestly is the single biggest thing you could do to increase your chance of winning or your chance of making an impact on these issues.
Great. I think we can open up with some questions. And I think this is being recorded, so should we try to use a microphone? Or all right. If I can repeat your. Yeah.
Yeah. More government. Probably not more government, probably not more taxes. No, you're fine.
Yeah, just to get on the record, the question is how do the Democrats come up with an all-encompassing broader message that's aspirational in the same way that Republicans will say less government is working?
So, and
Party platform right here.
yeah. So we have been doing a lot of research on this and talking to a lot of smart people. So I think the answer is, and that's exactly right, is that it often devolves into a laundry list of here's all the policy items that we want to accomplish, which is not the way to go. I think when you look at a message like Make America Great Again, that's what we're kind of aiming for on the Democratic side. And we've done some research and some testing around that with the Democrats to try and figure out what that message would be. So I don't know if that's going to be ruled out. Okay.
I work with Kate, and we've done essentially a brand research on what it means, what political parties mean to people, and what can the Democratic Party mean to people in a meaningful way. And when it comes to government, the idea that our mission is to make the government and the economy work for everybody, not just a privileged few, is the big idea that people like about Democrats and government. A simple overarching idea like that you can frame any issue.
Can you share sort of, I mean, obviously, briefly, a lot the past 40 years. I would love to sort of understand either where you think it comes from. Personally, like from your own advanced thinking or research that you did with your work, it would be helpful for folks who are thinking about like where are some traditional failures that we all agree with, and how can we sort of
Yeah, so I'll try to frame it in the context of the panel. Is we had failures obviously last year, failures down the ballot for the past several years. Is what messaging failures have happened? How can we do better? Are there certain examples you can give where the messaging was just wrong from the start, and what we can do better there?
Yeah, I mean, I'll start, and I'm sure they have examples too. I think the single biggest problem in 2016 was that our messaging was too focused toward people like us, kind of a more cosmopolitan. We made messages that appeal to more cosmopolitan voters, to more educated voters, and some of that is technical. We've done a lot of research in the last year. We gave a presentation at APOR, and I'd be happy to talk to anyone about it. Is that in traditional web panels, it turns out that a lot of these that people used for research, that a lot of these educated cosmopolitan voters were overrepresented in our surveys. In our phone polls, it definitely seems like we were getting a more cosmopolitan and educated sample, and that's a big reason why the polls were wrong in 2016. So that's like a direct thing, which is when Democratic officials said for every person we lose, for every working class voter we lose in in Pennsylvania, we get 2 suburban voters in the suburbs. Their polls said that was right, and that's why they picked the messages that they did. But so I think part of it is just that our measurement apparatus has been flawed and kind of pointed us in a direction toward messages that appeal to kind of urban cosmopolitan voters, and ended up engendering a lot of backlash among working class voters in rural areas. But the second thing is just this cognitive bias we all have, which is that we all wanted to run a very specific kind of campaign against Trump, and that campaign appealed to us a lot personally, but didn't actually persuade people, and in some cases cost us votes. So I think just in terms of avoiding that, being more hard-nosed about these things, insisting on testing things, and starting with this intuition that if you like an ad, it's probably bad. It's like the single biggest takeaway.
I can add a little bit to that. If you're using the term failure very broadly, which maybe that's fine. I think in terms of what we're aware of, there were certainly failures of polling to predict that Donald Trump was going to win, but that wasn't unique to the Democrats. No one's polling thought that Donald Trump was going to win, including his own. So to me, that points to broader structural issues in the survey research industry more generally. And some of the mistakes and oversights that David's talking about, they're not just on our side. When we have telephone response rates that are below 5%, then all the assumptions that go into producing a poll in terms of sampling and weighting and modeling, those assumptions carry much greater weight final result that you get presented with and that people are seeing to make decisions on the basis of. And if those assumptions are wrong, then you're gonna get wrong information. And so a lot of people are making very similar assumptions, in many cases based on similar data sources, and it just turned out to be wrong. So I think that there's a lot of flux in the polling industry right now and in the research industry right now. People are aware that these assumptions were wrong. People are trying to do research on their own practices and figure out how that could have happened, with the goal of making the research more robust for the future, allowing for more uncertainty, and also exploring new methodologies and being a bit more open to trying new methodologies to see if we can avoid some of those mistakes that we had in the past. Now, if you want to talk about other sorts of mistakes, about messaging and all that other stuff, I'm not qualified to talk about that, but I can tell you that about the research side of it.
Yeah, I can give one specific example of a lesson learned from some work that we did around Islamophobia in the United States. And I think that the Democrats make this mistake in a lot of their messaging, which is when confronted with an issue where the other side is based on fear, we can't ignore that fear or try and dismiss it. You have to acknowledge that the fear is very real. And then go from there. Because just trying to say that, oh, it's silly for you to be afraid that your Muslim neighbor is going to kill you, it's not, it doesn't work. And it makes people feel like you don't understand them, you're out of touch, which is, a problem for around a lot of issues that we talk about. So I think there are some messaging failures that we've seen that we can definitely learn from. Again, speaking, less about the functional benefits, less about politics as a transactional process, vote for us and you'll get these things, and more about an identity that you can relate to, where you feel like I vote Democrat because I am a Democrat and I can express these values through voting. So yeah, there's a lot that we've learned over the last couple of years about communications and messaging that I think we see those failures all the time.
Yeah. So how do we turn actual support into action? That's.
Yeah, that's a great question. I think, so in terms of communications, there are some very specific things that we need to make sure that reach people. So it's not just about making them aware of the problem and making them care about the cause. I think a lot of times we stop there. We also need to make sure that they understand what the solution is and how that connects intuitively to the problem. Make sure we're describing the problems in ways that sound intuitive but also solvable. If we're talking about big systemic problems, it's often demotivating because you think, what am I going to do as one person to eliminate, income inequality? So making problems sound solvable and then giving people concrete actions that they can take. And recognizing that, again, part of this research is identifying different motivations and values that can mobilize people to take action, because not everybody wants to do the same action. Some people are much more likely to want to attend events in person or reach out to their friends and network. Some people just want to do some online advocacy. They want to tweet out some stuff. Maybe they would write some think pieces. So identifying how people want to be engaged is really important, and not just doing, asking for one action from everybody, but making sure also that there's a sense of urgency and why it's important to act now. So creating either a sense of opportunity, which is sort of the Obama approach of hopey change, or this sort of fear-based, this is what we could lose if we don't act now. So I think making sure that our communications are doing all of those things and not just telling people, there's this huge problem, we have to do something, because you can often lose people there.
Just one quick thing is that if you're trying to get people to take action, like donate or volunteer, one big advantage is that we actually directly observe that, as opposed to persuasion, where we don't actually get to know if an ad that we did persuaded a swing voter. So one thing I'll say when it comes to donations is just because you can directly observe it, it's a lot more feasible to iterate and to test things. And my general experience with stuff around fundraising is that all of the frameworks in the world can't help you. Like, people generally are really bad at predicting what emails are going to do well and which ones are going to do badly or which tactics are going to do well. So when it comes to engagement, we're really fortunate that one, people who volunteer are actually kind of like the people in this room, so our intuitions help a bit there, and two, that we can cheaply and quickly test a bunch of different stuff. That's just something to keep in mind, is that you shouldn't be too wed, especially on engagement, to any particular framework, and that you should just be testing a lot of things.
John, and I think that's going to be our last one, but there's the data think tank after this that I don't know the structure for that, but we can continue.
Two really interesting things that have emerged from this is that we need to do a lot more testing and that our testing doesn't work. Right? The problem, and one of the key problems we grapple with is that the people we care the most about are the least likely to take our surveys. Right? People who don't like talking about politics to strangers don't take the polls. So what are you guys, as we're thinking about that, what are some of the new approaches that we're trying? Anybody else in the room has ideas? This to me is like the number one crisis of the list.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more with that. Just generally after, and I'm sure Drew has done a lot too, but since the 2016 election, my firm Civis has totally changed the way that we do polling. At this point, we did a big deep dive into why all of the polls were wrong, and the answer is that survey takers are really, really weird. We discover new ways in which survey takers aren't representative of the population every single day, basically. And we find that a lot of the ways in which they're strange make sense. They're a lot more likely to trust their neighbors. They're a lot more likely to work in offices and less likely to be factory workers or truck drivers or work in retail. They're a lot more likely to have traveled abroad. They're a lot more likely to, report looking at architecture, liking sightseeing or liking watching, going to the movies. And so all of these biases kind of point in a certain direction of, not trusting the people around you, not trusting faith in government. And in 2016, if you're not talking to people who don't think that the system works, then you're probably going to get the result wrong. And so we've spent a lot of time in the last year and a lot of research and money in changing the way that we do surveys, so that we are getting enough people who have low levels of social trust, or who are truck drivers, or which is hard. Getting truck drivers to take surveys is really hard. But yeah, that's personally our approach, because I kind of touched on this earlier. I think one reason why we landed on a lot of the wrong messages in 2016 wasn't that, Democratic leadership is hopelessly neoliberal and really wants to push certain kinds of frames. It's just that we have a research process. We went through the research process and it gave us the wrong answer. And that's, kind of a dull, measurement-driven theory of change, but it's really imperative that we fix our measurement process.
Yeah, I would say that our approach is to just know as much about the people that we're talking with as possible. And the traditional phone poll where you parachute in and you hope someone answers the phone and they answer your 20 questions, and you have 5 or 6 demographic questions at the end, and that's it. That's not enough. And so we're trying to build up profiles of people. We actively put effort into getting people into our panel who are these unusual or hard to reach people. And we're constantly checking everything to make sure that they balance out and like I was saying, don't violate our assumptions in meaningful ways. But at least I think with the technology that is being built now, there's a path ahead.
Right.
So we can do the research that David was describing, figure out where the blind spots are, and get ahead of that. Whereas, the old way, which just getting people to pick up their phone, that's it. The second that they hang up the phone, they're lost.
Right.
And there's nothing you can do about that.
Yeah, just to touch on that a bit, the broader framework here is that as response rates get lower, the people who answer surveys are just fundamentally weirder and weirder, and we just need to collect lots of data in order to statistically de-weird them. And that's kind of the approach that the industry is going, is just kind of collecting online behavior, much longer demographic panels, collecting data over multiple surveys, so that we can do as much statistical adjustment as possible.
And I think there's also an element of this that, qualitative research, which, is not polling, so it's not as sexy, but is really valuable. And that's where we get a lot of our good insights and direction in terms of how are people actually thinking and talking about things when we craft messages. So figuring out ways that we can also make our quantitative research more qualitative in nature, and getting that that robust information out of people is something that we're also really interested in.